there will be 3 of us presenting during this presentation. I'm Mary Trevor, Brian Porter will be following me, and then Joan Bloom. We do have handouts over there on the table in the corner. Amy just said that the video taping tends to work a little bit better if we hold off on questions and do all the questions during about the last 15 minutes. So each of us will try to take around 20 minutes, and then the last 15 minutes or so will be for questions. So I'll get us rolling. As I said, I'm Mary Trevor. If you looked at that and thought Hamline, you are not alone. Most people do, but it's actually pronounced Hamlin. Don't ask me why. But in any event, I'm from Hamlin University School of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota. I, however, started the day today in Concord, but it was Concord, Massachusetts, because I grew up there, and I'm staying with my mom. So I just drove out from Concord. I'll go back to Concord for the rest of the weekend too. My handout consists in paper of a single bibliography about letter writing and emails. Naturally, as soon as I finished this, and I did call it a partial bibliography because I knew there was no way I was going to cover everything out there. As soon as I finished, I immediately started thinking of a whole bunch of other things I forgot to add in. But I do have that. In addition, on the Twin site, I downloaded a lot of the actual assignments that I'm going to be referencing during my presentation today. They really aren't in-class exercises. They are outside of class assignments for the most part. And they got long enough that once I started thinking about photocopying all this stuff, I thought these people do not want to have to go back home with the gigantic packet from me. So I'll show you where they are on the conference Twin site as we go along. So basically my intent here today is to talk more about kind of our general philosophy of incorporating this kind of teaching and education into our course overall. I won't be spending so much time on the individual assignments. I'll give you kind of an overview of some of the things that we've been doing, but I figured I have 20 minutes and I don't want to spend too much time on the individual things. So I'm going to be zipping through fairly quickly and some of the stuff, but if you do have questions, and save them, make a note and save them to the end, I'd be happy to talk to you about them. The other thing I tend to do, and I was mentioning this to my fellow panelists, is I often forget about my PowerPoint. So if I seem to be talking about something that's several screens ahead, Mary or somebody can give me a sign and tell me I should do a little bit more clicking. I thought I'd give you a little bit of background. First of all, although I did call this presentation a letter writing presentation, it's really much more about letter writing and email. And I think I didn't want my title to get too long, and also we're really trying to develop a philosophy of not thinking of these things as terribly separate. That all of these are important kinds of communication skills, they really all need to go together. To the extent that you're talking about professional communication skills, you're talking about a certain level of formality that's still going to apply, whether you're talking about writing a traditional formal letter or writing a professional email. And for a while, we thought we were doing pretty well with this in Hamlin. We would start our second semester with teaching our students about formal client advice letters. We spent a fair amount of time on it in class. We had them do it as a fairly significant graded assignment. And in fact, great, check that off our to-do list. Then after we've been doing that for a while, we added in professional emails, and we had them do a professional email assignment, talked about it in class, had a lot of student enthusiasm talking about professional emails, and thought, great, we're doing really well, this is wonderful, let's check that off of our to-do list. Well, this is us, based on the feedback we got. We didn't get negative feedback from the students. The students were fine. Okay, we did a client letter, we did an email. But what we started finding was when we talked to people who were teaching the students in the second and third year, is that they would come to us and say, why don't you teach the students about client advice letters? And we'd say, we do. It's the first thing we do, beginning of second semester. And people would come and say, yeah, but when I ask them if they've ever done it before, they say no. They all get this blank look on their faces. So we thought, okay. Clinical person, the clinical director came up and basically said the same thing. Why don't you guys teach client advice letters? And we thought, And then our own experience was that even though we didn't have the students actively do a client advice letter again after the beginning of the second semester, we did around that same time do a professional email assignment. So we thought, well, now our emails are going to look fabulous. We're going to get these great emails from our students. Well, that's not what happened. I continued to get emails from my students that said things like, hey, prof, or that had no subject line, no opening salutation, incomplete sentences, some very inappropriate closing in some fashion or another. One of the other professors in our program said, I just got one that opened with, hey, dude. woman about my age. You know, so it's not something to ordinarily think of as a dude. And so they're thinking, you know, this stuff isn't sticking. We've really got to take a different approach because our students have to do this stuff all the time. The feedback we're getting from people, we just hired new faculty because we expanded to a third semester. And during the interviews, the thing that came up over and over again is they need to know how to write letters. They need to know how to write professional emails. That's going to be one of the most important things you teach them. And so we thought, okay, we got to do this differently. So we basically re-strategized our approach to this, and we were facing a number of issues, of course, which is that, okay, we needed to build a better base for it. We somehow needed to reinforce these skills for the students. We needed to make sure they really understood what they were doing and the importance of it so that they were really just not looking at this as, oh, this is just something I did in legal writing at one point. We really did need to make them not merely practice ready, which of course was maybe some years ahead, but they needed to be ready for their upcoming classes. They need to be ready for their clinics. They needed to be ready for their practicum experiences and things like that. And then of course we ran across the problem that we all constantly run across when we were writing is how the heck do we fit it in when we have all of these other million things that we're trying to do. So basically we made a number of different changes. One of them was to really just try to get going right at the beginning of the year with starting to talk about some of these things. And also to break it down into much more basic stuff so that we would start talking about some of this in very simple ways earlier on. We'd have simpler assignments. Then over the course of the year, to the extent that they had to do this, they started to need to do more in-depth, more complex assignments based on doing some sort of client letter or some sort of professional email. So we were really focusing on establishing basic principles, one of which, of course, is that to the extent that we were talking about letters and emails, as I was saying earlier, we really weren't talking about things that were that different from each other, that you needed to think about a similar level of formality and importance when you're talking about these. We also needed to think a lot more about effective teaching in terms of developing a sequence that would actually work so that we were really building these skills over time. And what we really ended up doing, and not everybody in the department does exactly the same thing, but I'm going to give you examples of some of the different things that people are doing. But overall, all of us in the department really are ending up doing something where we're doing a combination of email or letter assignments that are fairly short, not terribly complicated, and that are paired with the submission of a somewhat more complex, formal assignment. And we're also doing letter and email assignments that really are standalone assignments, that where the letter itself or the email itself does cover a fairly complex, in-depth analysis, and it's being presented in letter or email form rather than in a formal, traditional kind of memo situation. And as a result, what we're really aiming for is to give continuous reminders to the students through the program about the importance of these kinds of communications, and so that they realize that they're not simply going to be drafting documents and writing letters, but very typically as part of that, they're also going to have some sort of formal professional communication with somebody, and that they need to be thinking about that aspect of it as well. One of the more successful things that we did, and frankly I was pretty surprised by this, is we put a fairly simple policy into our syllabus right at the beginning of the year, basically saying, if you send an email to me, it has to be a professional email. You know, students don't always read the syllabus, but I noticed when I did it that I got much better emails right from the beginning of the year, and I was very surprised. And this is what I am going to show you because it's not that long. If I can do it quickly, I'm going to try to toggle over quickly to the conference site. And then from there, okay, here we go. I'm not finding it. Okay, I'll do this a little differently. So basically just part of the syllabus that they got at the beginning of the year saying you've got to send me appropriate emails and here are some of the things that you should be doing without getting into a lot of detail. Just here are certain basics. It made a difference. I was surprised, but it made a difference. So that's one of the first kind of basic things that we did. Okay. Another thing that we had started to realize over several years, but that we've just spent more time directly on in class now, students don't know how to write letters. They don't know how to address envelopes. They don't know how to format a business letter. I was shocked when my kids started to mail things for college applications. They were coming up to me with a standard mailing letter and saying, "Where does the return address go?" You know, as if a return address was some sort of foreign thing. I think, I thought my kids were kind of on the ball, and this is my own kids at home, and I thought, oh my gosh, my students are in the same situation. They just don't know basics about how to do this. And so something that's just very basic is if you go to the Purdue OWL, the online writing lab, they have a part that is how to write a business letter. And it's very basic. Here's the format that you use. You have some choices of format. So I just go ahead and talk to my students about this and how to write a business letter, because many of them have never done anything like that. So we go ahead and make sure to put that in. And this PowerPoint is posted on the site, on the conference website. As I've already mentioned, we really do try to make sure that students start changing their conception of email. Really start thinking about it differently. And you can get a pretty broad range in your class of student perspectives on this. This past fall, just finishing up this semester, I taught a group of students in our part-time weekend program, and most of the students in the weekend program have professional experience. So I found a lot of them when we had a class discussion about how is professional email different from a regular email. They were pretty on the ball about it and already had a sense, but last year when I taught in our weekday program and I was teaching with more traditional students, generally meaning students who graduated from undergrad programs much more recently, I found that for them a lot of these were eye-opening kinds of things where they just hadn't thought about things like not using emoticons, thinking about how do you actually address the person. Does it matter, and this is a big one for students, does it matter what you put in the subject line? And the idea that the subject line can make a huge difference as to the kind of attention that your email gets, whether it gets attention and how quickly it gets attention, and that you don't just hit reply to whatever email this person sent you 3 months ago. Things like that. A lot of students really don't get that. That they really need to give the same level of attention and care. Yeah, Melissa.
Do you ever think that using emoticons may actually be okay or a good idea to make sure that the person understands your tone?
I can see that. We generally have taught so far not to do it. I could see in a more detailed or complex discussion. I'd have to ask one of our other faculty members because he teaches online dispute resolution. And I don't know if they use emoticons or not. I could see that because, of course, one of the critiques of online dispute resolution is that people can't tell the tone of voice and they don't know where you're coming from sometimes. So I think that is an interesting question. But pretty much every resource you read out there right now about professional email says no emoticons.
I mean, I've taught online negotiation, but I think that's a benefit that they don't know, because you can have more studied responses and it's not off the cuff, and that your counterpart can't see your face reddening and you're
yeah. So it is. I mean, it's a really interesting concept.
Mary, could you just? I don't know if there's anybody else as low tech here as I am, but I have no idea what an emoticon is.
It's a smiley face. The smiley face part.
Okay, I know what a smiley face is.
Yeah, or something like that.
Okay, yeah.
Right, or the text messaging, LOL, laugh out loud,
Right.
things like that. So.
I'm with you.
Yeah, and of course part of that, kind of relating to Melissa's question, I think is, what's appropriate for the given situation? Is an email appropriate for a given situation? Is a formal letter appropriate for a given situation or a given client? Is an in-person conversation going to make a whole lot more sense? And again, tying into, somebody earlier was talking about you have to know your audience and you have to be thinking about your audience. Where, one of the nice things about this stuff is it gives you the opportunity to talk about a lot of other things your students need to know about, like thinking about your audience, clarity, how do you do that in this particular setting? Another thing that we have tried to do is to make students better aware. I think this is part of why they were getting confused looks sometimes in our second and third year courses, is that students sort of have a sense of, well, there's a letter out there, but they don't realize that there are a lot of different kinds of letters that lawyers do. So although we don't necessarily manage to fit all of this in for all of the students, these are the kinds of range, thank you, that we're looking at. So we're looking at possibilities for students drafting a retainer agreement in a letter form, doing some sort of just fairly basic transmittal or enclosure, again, possibly a letter or an email, some kind of a more formal, more detailed, more in-depth opinion or advice letter, or again, possibly in an email. Something that's a little more basic, perhaps, again, just sort of confirming a scenario or a situation, updating somebody on the status. That's actually a really nice one, in particular for making sure that students are understanding the facts in a situation. One of the assignments that one of my colleagues has used is after they have given the students an assignment and they're supposed to have started figuring out and working on the facts, the students have to draft an email to the client confirming their understanding of the facts. So then we now have a third semester in our program that's relatively new. One of the faculty members there has set up a situation for the students to do a demand letter. Half the students do the demand letter, half the students do the response to the demand letter. And this is where you'll see a number of examples, and let's see if I can get to it fairly quickly because I'm getting close to my end of my time. And then I'm going to just give you a quick overview of how some of this lays out. Go to materials. You'll see I kind of hogged a bunch of space here because I wanted to give you some examples. So there's a sample confirmation email assignment, a transmittal email assignment, a transmittal letter assignment, an email memo assignment, a less formal but an analytical memo, client letter assignment, and a demand letter assignment. So I posted all of those up there so you can get a quick look at them. And let's just try to zip through just a few more things before I finish up my time. So our initial approach in first semester is more of a kind of a build and pair approach where the students don't have to do anything terribly in-depth. It gives us the opportunity to focus more on just the basics. What do you need to be thinking about when you're doing emails, when you're writing letters? So initially we've done I've already shown you the syllabus assignment. They have to start thinking right from the beginning of the year about emails to their instructor. We have a group of sort of fungible professionalism points that students are automatically assigned at the beginning of the year, and within the instructor's discretion, they can, all or some of them can be deducted partway through the year. And we don't grade emails, but we do indicate that if we're getting inappropriate emails from the students, it could potentially lead to a professionalism deduction. Some of the pairing kind of assignments are that we have them do a statutory redrafting assignment of just a marvelously badly written Minnesota statute about the unauthorized practice of law. And when they submit that assignment, a legislator has asked them to do it. To submit it to the legislator, they do it as an attachment to an email, so they have to do a fairly simple formal cover email. Here's the confirmation email to the client that I mentioned as an interim assignment for the research memo, confirming the understanding of the facts. And then when they submit their research memo, we set up a scenario where we basically said a little while before the research memo was due, guess what? The assigning attorney has had a family emergency come up, has had to leave town. We need to get another attorney in the firm up to speed really quick. So when you submit the research memo, in addition, please do a one-page letter that gives the attorney an overview of what's going on in your memo so that while she's plowing through all these papers, she can pull out your letter and get really quickly what's going on in your memo. Of course, the memo had the question presented in brief answer and things like that too, but we wanted to give them a different opportunity to learn summarizing skills and communication skills and to get a sense of letter. One of the nice things in particular about these building and pairing assignments during the first semester is that they don't take that much time to prepare because they're closely connected to something else, and it's not a lot of extra time for the students either. So we found that they fit pretty readily in without us feeling like, oh my gosh, we've just added a huge amount of work to first semester. Okay, there we go. Some of the more significant assignments that we do later in the program, we do a full-out, fairly formal, in-depth client advice letter second semester. Some of the students do somewhat less formal email memo that doesn't have to have all of the precise components that the formal analytical memo does. As I've already mentioned, we do a demand letter during the third semester, continuing email expectations throughout the course about being appropriate. Something we haven't touched on, but one of the readings in the bibliography, that is the one paper copy handout that I have for you, is there is material out there about text messaging. So overall, the approach we're taking really is kind of, aiming for enlightenment. But we're kind of trying to be creative as we go. And if as part of an assignment you think, oh, I could have them do an email about this as part of it, or I could have them do a quick letter about this as part of it, we're really finding it's not that hard to fit a little more of this stuff in and really start to underscore for students what's going on. Okay. So Brian, why don't you take it away?
Thank you. Let me ask you,